Hello and welcome. In this video, I shall be presenting a brief historical overview of South Park Street Cemetery, a disused colonial-era Christian cemetery in Kolkata, West Bengal, India, and we will be looking at its importance from a number of perspectives. Part 1. Historical background. Let us begin with this question. Is Kolkata's South Park Street Cemetery the oldest English cemetery in the city? Well, the answer is no. Although itself an antiquity, Calcutta's South Park Street Cemetery is neither the oldest nor the first which the British had in Calcutta. That distinction belongs to what is today the premises of St. John's Church at Dalhousie Square, Kolkata. The earliest recorded burial at this site is that of Job Charnock, often credited as the founder of Calcutta, who died and was buried here in 1693 under an Islamic-style tomb. The image in the slide is detailed from a plan of the city of Calcutta dated 1756, and the square part highlighted in red shows the location of the Old English Cemetery near the Old Fort William. It was a very small, crowded and overused cemetery and had received over 16,000 burials to 1767 by one estimate. Akin to its successor in Park Street, this cemetery housed several funerary monuments over graves, many of which were leveled off in order to make room for the St. John's Church, finished 1787, which came to occupy part of the site. Fortunately for us, some of the remaining tombs were obscurely depicted in a 1788 view of the church by the English artist Thomas Daniel. The images in this slide, which have been cropped from Daniel's view, show the remaining monuments in the old cemetery, and as you can see, they all appear to be very much overgrown. The people in the foreground will give us an idea as to how large these tombs actually were. Job Charnock's tomb is visible at the farthest left corner. Further demolition ensued in 1800, when these monuments were found to be dilapidated and dangerous to those such as approached them, and only a few of them remain today. However, by 1766, the need for a new cemetery away from the British settlement was greatly felt, and the search had begun for an appropriate site. This slide features two relevant extracts from the consultation book of Fort William, which sums up the process. For example, the first extract reads, "The present burying ground, situate in the middle of the town, is also very detrimental to the health of the inhabitants and too much confined. The civil architect is therefore directed to point out a more convenient situation for one to be made of proper dimensions." The next consultation reads, "The President acquainted the board that the new burying ground near Mr. Vansittart's garden being now ready, they desired the clergyman to consecrate it, as the sickly season is approaching." And this consultation is dated 25th of August 1767. Here, the sickly season refers to the monsoon months in India, roughly July to September, which was especially prejudicial to the health of the European in India, and always claimed an unbelievably higher toll of life every year. So, the opening of the new cemetery was the pressing need of the hour. This slide features detail of a 1763 plan of Calcutta, showing the area around Park Street. The red line marks the road which was to become Park Street in later years. The exact site of the cemetery lies beyond the town's boundaries, which is shown as nondescript grassy fields in this plan. This meant a southeastward shift of approximately 3.3 kilometers from the European settlement, or White Town, centered around today's Kolkata GPO. The building highlighted in purple is presumably what has been referred to as Mr. Vansittard's garden, or garden house, in one of the last proceedings. Now, this building was occupied first by Henry Vansittart, the governor, and then by Sir Eliza Impey, and even later by the Loreto Convent, or today's Loreto College, and so it has continued ever since. There was a huge, sprawling deer park attached to this mansion, which eventually gave the name Park Street to the road. However, the first burial was that of a John Wood, a writer in the council house, on 25th of August 1767. So began the new cemetery, which in the beginning had no proper name, frequently referred to as the English burying ground, the Protestant burying ground, and so on in contemporary sources. The earliest mention of the great burial ground Chowringhee can be traced to 1800. The name Park Street today conjures up images of posh restaurants, bars and cafes, Christmas crowds, state-of-the-art showrooms, prestigious academic institutions, and in general all things Western and elite. Mother Teresa Sarani is but a mere formality, but the thoroughfare had a much more sinister and depressing name in the very beginning, Burying Ground Road, so called from the new cemetery which this road led to. And as Chowringhee was noted for its palatial neoclassical buildings, many attractive buildings were located on this grimly named thoroughfare, and contemporary advertisements about sale of dwelling houses or properties often bring out the ironies of this coexistence. For example, this is an advertisement dated 22nd May 1786 from the Calcutta Gazette for the sale of an elegant and commodious house situated at Chowringhee next to the road leading to the burying ground. The next advertisement is about an eligible spot for building situated on the south of the burying ground road. This last advertisement goes a step further, informing of a singularly neat, airy and pleasant upper room dwelling house situated on the northern side of and in the most cheerful part of the burying ground road. The earliest mention of the name Park Street has been noted by me in 1795 in a government notice, but Burying Ground Road prevailed for 2 more decades, before finally giving way to Park Street in the 1810s, as this last advertisement shows. High mortality caused by tropical heat and insalubrious monsoons continued to plague the Europeans in India, and the survivors were often left horrified by the sudden deaths of their friends and compatriots, a frequent theme in contemporary observations. To take but one example, Sophia Goldsbourne, the fictitious teenage protagonist in the 1789 novel Hartley House, Calcutta, writes home to her friend Arabella of the scene in Calcutta. All funeral processions are, however, concealed as much as possible from the sight of the ladies, so that the vivacity of their tempers may not be wounded. Funerals are indeed solemn and affecting things at Calcutta. It often happens in the gay circles that a friend is dined with one day and the next in eternity. The feelings are interested, the sensations awful, and the mental question, for the period of interment at least, which will be tomorrow's victim. In a similar vein, Emma Roberts, who visited Calcutta in the 1830s, writes, "The sensibilities of so many persons are so much affected by the sight of the funeral processions, which almost every evening wend their way to the burial ground of Calcutta, as to render them unwilling to live in Park Street, the avenue which leads to it. The scene is calculated to inspire the most gloomy emotions." Thus, it is no wonder that undertaking or the trade of conducting funerals was one of the most profitable trades in Calcutta, and communal bereavement found expression via these tradesmen in the plethora of monuments, small and large, which came to adorn, or rather congest, the cemeteries. However, South Park Street Cemetery and its other neighbors, to which I shall shortly return, started to become congested soon after opening, largely owing to the construction of huge funerary monuments over graves. Maria Graham, visiting in 1810, observed that there are many acres covered so thick with columns, urns, and obelisks that there scarcely seems to be room for another. It is like a city of the dead. It extends on both sides of the road, and you see nothing beyond it. Concerned authorities responded to the situation by issuing prohibitory orders limiting sizes of monuments to be erected, although with limited success, and lastly by extending the burial ground. As many as 2 extensions are recorded, and the letter of an Irish Jesuit from Calcutta in 1835 neatly sums up the crisis. This is a most remarkable year, and for what think you? For the number of European deaths. The English burial ground is completely filled, and they are about to enlarge it, although at present it is the largest I have ever seen. I think if the Protestants were as numerous here as in London, the whole city would be surrounded by a graveyard, because not only families, but individuals occupy large portions of ground. Members of councils, judges, councillors, parsons, attorneys, civilians, officers, etc., have to bewail the loss of their office mates. However, the opening of the vast Lower Circular Road Cemetery in 1840 meant the unofficial end of South Park Street Cemetery and its neighbours. Unofficial because burial in previously purchased family vaults continued well into the 1930s. This inscription at the cemetery gate is somewhat misleading because it gives the year of closure as 1790, which is in fact both true and false. The cemetery did close once in 1790 but had to be reopened due to pressure, and remained in continuous use till 1839 and 40. Part 2. The Lost Park Street Cemeteries. It might strike many citizens of Calcutta that unlike today, as many as 4 cemeteries stood on the farthest end of Park Street, which were collectively called the Park Street Cemetery, although 2 of them had their own names. Still beyond were, and luckily still today are, 2 more cemeteries, Lower Circular Road Cemetery and the Scottish Cemetery. This is the relevant section from Frederick Walter Sims's map of Calcutta, made from surveys conducted during 1847 and 1849, within a few years after the closure of the Park Street cemeteries, which shows all the 6 cemeteries. 3 of the 4 cemeteries on Park Street have fallen prey to encroaching urban development, with the result that many of the citizens hardly know that they once existed. We will take a quick glance at the 3 lost cemeteries and their particulars. This is a general view of the North Park Street Cemetery in the 1850s, which shows a large variety of monuments. The cemetery was cleared in the 1950s and its only survivor is this solitary gazebo, silently existing in a corner on the main road, just opposite South Park Street, while several tombstones were rescued from the debris to be embedded on the eastern boundary wall of South Park Street, a common practice when such cemeteries are cleared. The site is today occupied by the Assembly of God Church School and the Mercy Hospital. Mission Cemetery, the smallest of the 4, served the congregation of the Old or Mission Church, founded in 1761 by the Swedish missionary John Zachary Akiananda, the first Protestant missionary to Bengal. His first wife, Anne Akiananda, was the first person to be interred in the ground, and this is her tomb, which was also the family mausoleum of the Akiananda family. The cemetery was cleared along with North Park Street, and Anne's tombstone today rests in the basement of the Assembly of God Church, which now occupies the site. This is a view of a random, overgrown tomb in Tiretta Cemetery in 1977, a few months before its clearance. The cemetery's tombstones have likewise been placed together in a section called the French Piazza at the heart of South Park Street, while some stray marble monuments lie scattered here and there inside the cemetery premises. The site is today occupied by the APJ School, Park Street. This table summarizes the particulars of the 3 lost cemeteries and shows which present-day buildings and institutions occupy their sites. Now, with the destruction of these cemeteries, have also been lost the graves of a few important personages who may be worthwhile to take a look at. My first candidate is Nathaniel John Halhed, son of the more famous Orientalist Nathaniel Bracy Halhed, who wrote one of the first Bengali grammars and produced the first printed book featuring Bengali typeset. John was destined to have a career in the judiciary, although we are told that under the tuition of his father he had an unrivaled proficiency in the colloquial Bengali tongue, and also that William Carey, the pioneer of Bengali printing, used to consider him the first vernacular Bengali scholar in the country. The images shown here are a bust of John's Orientalist father, Nathaniel Brassey Hallett, in the collection of Victoria Memorial Hall, Kolkata, and the title page of the same person's pioneering Bengali grammar. John was buried in North Park Street Cemetery in 1838, 8 years after his father's death in London, but the tomb has been lost. Colonel James Achilles Kirkpatrick was a British resident at the court of Hyderabad between 1797 and 1805. He came out to India full of ambition, intent on making a name in the subjection of a nation, but instead it was he who was conquered, not by an army, but by a Hyderabadi noblewoman, Khairun-Nisa, whom he married according to Muslim law in 1800. He also converted to Islam, adopted a Mughal lifestyle, and became a double agent, working on behalf of the Hyderabadis in their struggles against the East India Company. Kirkpatrick has been immortalized in William Dalrymple's book White Mughals, and the old British residency he built at Hyderabad is a major tourist attraction today. Kirkpatrick and Khairun-Nisa's daughter, Catherine or Kitty Kirkpatrick, had a thoroughly English upbringing and became the basis for Blooming, the heroine of Scottish author Thomas Carlyle's Sartor Resartus, and also the muse of many of his other novels. James Kirkpatrick, however, died away from his wife and children in Calcutta in 1805, leaving Khairun-Nisa a widow at the age of 19. He was buried in the North Park Street Cemetery, but the cemetery was cleared in the 1950s, thus obliterating one of the last surviving vestiges associated with Kirkpatrick in Calcutta. However, a church memorial dedicated to his memory by his father and brother still survives in Calcutta's St. John's Church. Frederick John Shore of the Bengal Civil Service was the second son of Sir John Shore, Governor General of Bengal from 1793 to 1798. He was an eccentric man, best known for his outspokenly critical observations on the English administration in India. He wrote a series of sensational letters in the India Gazette and Harkara under the pen name A Friend of India, which created excitement in the highest circles and earned him the nickname the Rebel Bureaucrat. He died only 2 days before reaching his 38th year and was buried in North Park Street, but again it has been obliterated. Richmond Thackeray of the Bengal Civil Service was the father of the celebrated Victorian satirist William Makepeace Thackeray. In 1803, he was made the collector of Birbhum and was known to the local as Tikri Sahib, and in 1807 became secretary to the Board of Revenue at Calcutta. In 1815, he died at the age of 32 and was buried in North Park Street Cemetery under an obelisk, which is shown here, but sadly it is lost today. Eduardo or Edward Tiretta was a Venetian architect and a close friend and protege of Giacomo Casanova, the controversial Italian adventurer whose name has become eponymous to womanizers. Tiretta fled to Calcutta after committing some political offense in his country and took up employment under the English Company as surveyor of roads and registrar of deeds. He owned, among others, a bazaar in Lower North Calcutta called Tiretta's Bazaar after him, which still survives today and is home to the Chinese community of Calcutta and a favorite destination for Chinese street food. In 1794, Tiretta, then in his late 60s, married Angelica de Carrion, a young French girl of 16 who died in childbirth 2 years later. She was initially buried in Barreto's Catholic burying ground, but Tiretta soon discovered to his horrors that not only the graves there were being reused, but also that the ground was not big enough to give vent to his bereavement in the form of a handsome monument. Unable to accept, he purchased a plot of ground near South Park Street Cemetery, and after reserving a place for his wife and himself, he dedicated it in trust to the Catholic authorities of Calcutta and Chandernagore for free use by Europe-born Catholics of these places, who could now lay their loved ones in permanent grave plots and erect monuments free of charge. These are some excerpts from the deed of sale dated 1797 And this is a curious notification which was published in the Calcutta Gazette of 29th March 1798, informing citizens of the recent act of charity by Tiretta. Tiretta reburied his girl wife in this new ground under a huge obelisk which is shown in this photo. The cemetery became known as Tiretta's burying ground or the French cemetery, owing to its numerous French inmates. As for Tiretta himself, he never used the plot reserved for himself, having returned some years later to Europe with his daughter and dying there. His wife's obelisk was standing till 1977, when the cemetery was altogether wiped out to make way for a school, and some tombstones were planted in the middle of South Park Street Cemetery. Angelica's tombstone was reported as lost in a booklet of the British Association for the Cemeteries in South Asia, although I discovered it in 2022, lying in an obscure corner of South Park Street Cemetery, broken into two. This tombstone, given its interesting history, is definitely worthy of better preservation and maintenance, and it is a unique artifact connecting Italy and Calcutta. This is a transcription of the Latin text of the partially damaged tombstone of Angelica, and the English translation is also given below. The flowery language as to the cause of her death is to be interpreted as that she died 2 days after giving birth to a girl child. Part 3. Curious Connections. In this section, we will look at some interesting familial links between historical personages and events which may be found at South Park Street Cemetery and which fortunately still exist. Dr. Tyso Saul Hancock or Handcock was an English surgeon in the company's service who in 1753 married Philadelphia Austen, elder sister of the novelist Jane Austen's father, and their only daughter Elizabeth was born in 1761, whom Jane Austen would refer to as her exotic cousin. Hancock came to Bengal in 1759 and obtained the post of sergeant at Fort William, Calcutta, with the support of Robert Clive. Warren Hastings was an intimate friend of the family. This 1765 painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds in the collection of Gemäldegalerie Galeria, Berlin, shows the Hancock family with their Indian maid Clarinda in the center. Some characters of Jane Austen's novels are colored by the Hancocks, and the novelist even dedicated her Love and Friendship, published 1790, to her cousin Elizabeth, the little girl in this painting. After the death of her French husband, Elizabeth married Jane Austen's fourth and favorite brother, Henry T. Austen, in 1797, thereby becoming also sister-in-law to the novelist. Despite having returned with his family to England in 1765, Hancock again had to come out alone to India in 1768 in search of a fortune which he never acquired, and died of malaria in 1775 at Calcutta. He was buried in South Park Street, and these are the photos of his monument, which today is in good repair but hidden behind nursery plants and hence easily overlooked. Barish Crisp is usually remembered as the witness to the marriage of Richmond Thackeray and Anne Beecher, parents of the English satirist William Makepeace Thackeray, which took place in 1810 at Calcutta St. John's Church. But apart from this, he also had a gift for languages. By the age of 12, he had mastered Persian, having spent some years in Persia, and before he was 16, joined a team of young men in Calcutta who were translating Hindu and Persian legal and administrative texts into English for the company. In 1792, he translated Tipu Sultan's revenue regulations into English from an original Persian manuscript. Familial responsibilities impeded his linguistic pursuits, although he did become one of the 30 founding members of the Asiatic Society of Bengal and married an Indian woman. Barish's father, James, was descended from Sir James Crisp, mentioned by Clarendon as a baronet in the reign of King Charles I. Crisp's mother, Elizabeth Marsh, was an extraordinary lady with an eventful, adventurous life, spending many years across continents. Marsh is perhaps best known for The Captive Lady, a narrative of facts which happened in Barbary, which is a personal account of her sufferings at the hand of Moroccan pirates in 1756. She, however, met her grave in Calcutta, where she died of breast cancer, after a painful surgery which she recorded in her journal. She is buried at the same spot as her son, although the inscription has long vanished. She is alluded to in her son's tombstone as buried close to him, and the last image shows the possible location of her grave. Marsh's life has been documented in 2007 by Professor Linda Coley in a fascinating book. John Talbot Shakespeare of Bengal Civil Service came from a family either connected with William Shakespeare's brother Gilbert or Uncle Thomas. This family, which spent their family name without the terminal E, had a coat of arms identical to that granted to the Elizabethan Bards family in 1596. However, the Calcutta Shakespeare family was also closely linked with the Calcutta Thackeray family by intermarriage. John Talbot Shakespeare, for example, married Richmond Thackeray's eldest sister, Amelia Thackeray, thus becoming Richmond's brother-in-law. Again, Richmond Thackeray's brother, Reverend Francis Thackeray, married John's sister, Mary Ann Shakespeare. Richmond was a patron of John Talbot and appointed him as an assistant collector in Billroom. John Talbot Shakespeare named his youngest son Richmond Campbell Shakespeare and another son William Makepeace Shakespeare after his illustrious relations. Interestingly, in 2014, former British Prime Minister David Cameron was reported to have descended from this John Talbot Shakespeare of Calcutta via his mother, and therefore also has some Thackeray blood in him. And I wonder, it might also be the reason as to why Mr. Cameron made some hilarious puns on the names of Shakespearean plays to criticize his opponents in the House of Commons in 2016, the 400 years death anniversary of the playwright. To return to our John Talbot, his remains are, however, not buried in Calcutta, he having died on his voyage from Calcutta to the Cape of Good Hope in 1825, and having been buried at sea. The monument in South Park Street Cemetery is only a cenotaph or an empty grave which his friends erected to his memory. Contrarily, his wife Emily died in Calcutta only a few months before him and is actually buried in South Park Street, although there is no tombstone or monument to be found, except in the Bengal obituary. Richard Becher was the fourth in Bengal Council and the chief of Dhaka at the time of the siege of Calcutta by Siraj-ud-Dowlah in 1756 and resident to the court of Murshidabad in 1769. Sir William Wilson Hunter has described him as the only Englishman who, amid misrepresentation and calumny, really strove to grapple with the Great Famine of 1770. In 1774, he retired to England with a modest fortune, but having lost this fortune in helping a friend, was obliged to re-enter company service as a mint master of the Calcutta Mint at the age of 60, and died in poverty in Calcutta a year later, although received a huge obelisk and a lengthy epitaph. His kinsman John Herman Becher's daughter was Anne Becher, mother of the Victorian satirist William Makepeace Thackeray. Part 4. South Park Street Cemetery as a forerunner of the Western world's modern cemetery. Beginning from the Middle Ages down to the early 19th century, burial in Europe was strictly church-centric. The wealthy, the royalty, and the holy were often buried inside church in crypts beneath the floor, while the common people, usually in a small ground attached to the church, called churchyard or more commonly graveyard. These latter burials were temporary in the sense that the graves were periodically cleared of human remains to make room for new burials, and the remains would be stored in charnel houses or ossuaries which surrounded the churchyard. Cemetery in the modern sense, that is, a separate burying ground away from the church, was virtually absent. But this existing system was put to test in the 18th century when an unprecedented rise in the population of Europe created an acute crisis of burial space, and the overcrowded parish churchyards became a source of putrefying stench and the breeding ground of epidemics. The crisis reached its nadir in Paris, where the infamous Cemetery of the Holy Innocents collapsed under overwhelming pressure in 1785, prompting the government to order the clearance of all Parisian churchyards of human remains and deposit them in an underground quarry, or what was to become the catacombs of Paris. In 1804, the first modern cemetery of the Western world, Père Lachaise, was opened on the outskirts of Paris, which provided the model for Europe and America to emulate, and gave an impetus to what may be called the 19th century burial reforms in Europe. However, in the various European settlements across the Indian subcontinent, the situation was quite different, trading and living under mostly Muslim authorities. From the very beginning, the early European settlers were obliged to place their burying grounds outside city limits, and had quite early adopted the practice of erecting Islamic-influenced funerary monuments of extravagant size over the graves. Finest examples include the English and Dutch cemeteries at Surat, Dutch cemetery of Kolkata near present-day Chennai, and to take a later example, Calcutta South Park Street Cemetery, and so on. The English cemetery at Surat so influenced the future architect Sir John Vanbrugh while he was a company trader at Surat that years later he would prescribe similar cemeteries in London during the 18th century discourse on burial reforms in Europe. Thus, Europeans in India laid the earliest modern cemeteries, which not only predated the change in Europe by at least half a century, but were also fairly responsible for burial reforms in Europe in the next century. In fact, Calcutta South Park Street Cemetery opened 37 years before Père Lachaise in Paris, and may arguably be a worthy contender of the latter. Part 5. As old as Herculaneum and Pompeii. The celebrated and controversial English poet Rudyard Kipling, upon his visit to South Park Street Cemetery in the early 1890s, could not help but note that the eye is ready to swear that it is as old as Herculaneum and Pompeii. The tombs are small houses. It is as though we walk down the streets of a town. So tall they are, and so closely do they stand. A town shriveled by fire and scarred by frost and siege. For each, the squat obelisk, the defaced classic temple, the cellaret of Chunam, or the candlestick of brickwork, the heavy slab, the rust-eaten railings, the whopper-jawed cherubs, and the apoplectic angels. Even more than half a century earlier, Maria Graham had noted on her visit the abundance of columns, urns, and obelisks in the cemetery. Even those not versed with these architectural jargons will readily admit that the scene in South Park Street Cemetery calls to mind images of ancient Greece and Rome. The archaeological discovery of the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum in the mid-18th century instantly kick-started the neoclassicism movement, a fashion of emulating all things classical, and classical elements featured heavily in contemporary arts, architecture, music, literature, and so on. No doubt that Giovanni Battista Piranesi's megalomaniac depictions of Pompeii and of the tomb-lined Via Appia Antica in Rome exerted considerable influence over the British colonists in India, via whom neoclassicism travelled far east to India. Thus, the urns adorning the tops of numerous monuments and not a few sarcophagi in South Park Street Cemetery maintain their contact with the long-vanished civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome, where burial in sarcophagi or stone-made body container and ash burial in urns were heavily practiced. The plethora of obelisks, both small and large, and pyramids owe allegiance to the ancient Egypt, where these forms originated, eventually being assimilated into the architecture of the Western world. To take but one example, The huge pyramid of Elizabeth Barwell in South Park Street Cemetery is based on Caius Cestius's pyramid in the Protestant cemetery of Porta Paola in Rome. Concluding remarks. Thus, Calcutta's South Park Street Cemetery is a unique site of considerable historical, archaeological, and cultural significance, and seeing it solely as an emblem of colonialism would be oversimplification of history. Its monuments and the lives and stories of the people buried in it are window to a long vanished period. Apart from its historical importance, the cemetery also serves as an open green space and carbon sink to the ever-growing metropolis. It may also serve as a spot for healthy recreation and seclusion away from the din and bustle of our city lives. Real estate giants must find a different way towards realizing their urban development projects, and the cemetery must be left alone to survive for many generations to come.